So we're gonna go ahead and get started with project number 2, our expanded on drypoint project using the PETG plate. The first thing we want to start to organize and think about is our actual image. So after kind of going with that, doing your research, and then you've actually emailed me and we've discussed it in person or face-to-face via Zoom, we will move forward with what we've decided for you to work on in your project and your imagery. And in doing that, you can pile your image in the same, working with the size of the plate that you're planning on working with. Here I have, you'll see kind of my reference photograph, and then you'll see my drawing that I had created from above it using this Duralar sheet. I'm actually going to use the Duralar drawing or the drawn image to generate the imagery on my plate and have it be as a reference to my mark making that I'm going to create on my drypoint plate using the PETG. The first thing I'm thinking about in my image is texture and movement, which tool I'm going to be using to make my marks. So obviously in this case, and it being probably your second project, you're going to want to do the same, but I used mostly the drypoint needle, or I'm planning to use the drypoint needle as my main source of mark making, or my main tool of mark making, as opposed to sandpaper or something a little bit more challenging that I just haven't experimented with a lot yet at this point for you guys. So again, just a really clean line drawing that I'm going to be working with. I used pencil for this one. Obviously, pen and ink is great too. The next thing I'm going to kind of think about is, again, when you're making these images, if you're working from a photograph and then transferring it to a drawing and then using that drawing as a guide for your actual plate or your matrix, which is great. You can work the other way around, where you're working from a photograph exactly as is and then kind of drawing over that. So it's just, there's lots of different ways to generate your imagery. A lot of people too, if you have drawings and sketchbooks and things like that, if you have access to a scanner, or you can go to a Kinko's or a print center, you can often scan drawings from your sketchbook, have them in Photoshop or Illustrator, make them to the same size or the size that you would need for your plate, and then print them out and have those as references, or scale them up and scale them down. Or if they're the exact size you need, that's great too, and then you can just trace and draw exactly from your drawing, or reference it that way. So you can kind of see I got this texture, this tree bark here. I have these kind of lines that are showing the movement of the bark, a little more dense in areas where it's darker, stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and move the actual image, reference image, to the side. One thing you might realize when you're cutting it is that you might actually get these kind of, when you're running your finger along the edge, there's a little catch there. It's just the bird of plastic that's kind of raised. The best thing to do with that is to actually take one of your scrapers. I take my nice little broken one here, but I'm actually going to scrape the edges of it. I would do this along the edge of my table, which I can show you guys when I move my camera. But really, you're just going to take your scraper and you're going to kind of break that burr off, and as you're doing it, you'll see it just kind of curl off in a big chunk and then fall. And then you just want to keep doing that until your finger doesn't catch on the edge anymore, and then that will prevent ink from sitting and catching in those borders, so that when you'd print, you'd actually get like this blotchy ink kind of line around the edge of your image, which isn't always great. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys that scraping. Okay, so here's scraping off that edge again with my broken scraper here, but pretty simple. just putting the lightest amount of pressure, not very hard, along the edge of that. And this is similar to how your beveling process would go, although beveling metals and a thicker piece of plexiglass would definitely take a little more effort and a lot longer, and you're going to be using a file instead of just the scraper. But this one's pretty straightforward and simple like that. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the other side as well. All right, so once I had those burrs kind of scraped off the side and it's completely flat and smooth, which is really what you're looking for, you go ahead and you probably want to clean the surface of your plate. And actually, before you do that, I would go ahead and take off the film on the back side of the plate. You don't have to. I know some students in the past like keeping it on in case they wanted to use that back side later on and they didn't want it to get scratched while moving around. I just find that when you're printing with it and inking it later on, it can get in your way and catch ink when you don't really want it to. So I always like to just peel off both sides of the film, but it's totally up to you. At this point, you can kind of work on either side of the plate, so it really just pick what you like to work with or which one you think is less scratched or feels like the top to you. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean it off with this, just alcohol. The next thing I'm going to do is I have my plate to size. I have my image here. Should line up for the most part. I think my plate isn't completely exact to the size of that, but that's okay. I'm not totally mad at that. There's a couple ways I could do this. Is I could either tape my plate down in certain corners and then kind of move that tape around as I get to that point on the plate in my drawing, or I could just kind of hold it down with one hand and draw, and then make sure it's always lined up as best as I can when I get there. What I think I'm gonna do though is I'm gonna tape the corners just to be really a little better about the moving of the plate. I'm always gonna use like some blue painter's tape. If you have artist tape, that's great too. As you can tell, I use the blue painter's tape for my finger. So that is, I didn't have Band-Aids in here today, so Band-Aids are a good thing to keep by. Actually, was with the it was with the Buren that I scraped my finger, which I can show you guys that later. But all right, so I'm gonna move those pieces of tape and leave this one out because I'll work this corner and then kind of work circular into the plate that way. All right, the tool I'm gonna use to get started with my drawing, I think I was doing some test plates earlier and I was really enjoying working with this weighted dry point or weighted etching needle. And so I think I'm going to use that. I may even switch around a little bit. I have a couple of them, and if I feel like I'm going to move up to a different tool, I can do that. Again, you guys most likely will want to invest in just one that you really enjoy. Drawing on this plate or scratching into it with my etching needle, which I actually just ended up using that same weighted needle the entire time. I feel like I'm complete at this point, and you can kind of start to see the plate a little bit and the texture of it. And I'm not sure if you could see in the time-lapse video, but I was actually kind of feeling my marks as I was going along just to make sure that I had raised line work that I know hopefully will catch some ink and things like that. When you're doing dry point plates, especially these PETG, and even when you move to copper, you're gonna wanna check for that raised texture, and that's what's gonna actually hold your ink and provide a really rich line when you're printing. There is the possibility of using really light line work in order for it to print. Like I was mentioning before, scratches on the plate often will show up when you're printing. But just making sure that you have a decent weight while you're doing this too. You don't want to go through an entire drawing pressing either too light or too heavy actually, and then it distorts your image in a way that is not what you intended. So really, I suggest honestly doing tests before you get to a point where you work on your final plate. I'm gonna go over one quick one that I have right here. This is a smaller test plate that I had pulled, I think, from when I was mentioning that I had those mechanical errors in my plate from when I opened it up through the packaging. But so what I ended up doing is actually testing out different tools as well as different pressures with the needle across. I even have some sandpaper mark you see here in the middle that was generated with a stencil that I created using Duralar. I really honestly suggest doing this before you move on to anything larger or more structured that you would do for the second project. I would have this smaller plate and the smaller test plate be the very first thing you ever print on your new little pasta press. So go ahead and cut one of your scrap pieces into a smaller square or whatever you have available, and get that started. So I tested out a lot of different needles. I'm gonna actually probably make some more marks, again, varying in weight and kind of in the pressure that I use to create the lines, so really light ones versus really heavy ones. And then I will actually print this before I print this plate, just to give you guys a sense of what different mark making and obviously pressing your tool into the plate will do as opposed to making it really light. So